All right, welcome back to the second part of our emotion and motivation chapter here. So, we ended by talking about money and happiness. We introduced the topic. Now we're actually going to talk about it. So, money and happiness, everybody thinks there's a relationship between the two, but the reality is a little bit more nuanced. So, for example, uh, survey after survey after survey has asked people a question similar to this one here. Do you think you would be happier if you made more money? You can ask this question any which way you want. You can ask it to just about any group on the planet, and about 3/4 of them will say, yes, if I made more money, I would be happier. So we can say about 75% of the people on this planet think that money would make them happier. Well, more money would make them happier. The top priority of US college students is to be well off financially, not to be happy, to be well off financially. Obviously, the thinking here is that being well off financially will make us happy. All right, let's talk about this because, like I said, the relationship between money and happiness is nuanced. There's not a direct one-to-one correlation. The reality is what's known as diminishing returns. So, what that means is that the value of money, the increase in happiness you get from money, decreases the more money you have. So, for example, if you have a relatively small amount of money and you get an increase in the amount of money that you have, that will make you happier. So, if you're poor and you get more money, that will make you happier. But if you're already rich and you get more money, that has pretty much no impact on your overall happiness. So just think about that for a second. It's pretty easy to imagine. Like, let's say you or I are walking down the street and we come across $100 bill in the middle of the sidewalk. Holy cow, $100 just sitting there waiting for us. We pick it up, put it in our pocket, and for the rest of the day, we just have a smile on our faces. Probably for the whole week, we're feeling pretty good about that $100 we just found. Now imagine it's not you or I walking down the street, but it's Bill Gates or it's Elon Musk or it's Jeff Bezos, very famous billionaires. They're walking down the street, they see $100 bill. Heck, they might not even stop to pick it up. Like, oh my gosh, a dirty $100 bill? I'm not touching that thing. I'm not putting that in my pocket. Got germs all over it or something like that. It would have relatively no effect on their happiness anyway. So that's what I mean by diminishing returns. The less money you have, the more that money increases your happiness. The more money you have, the less that money increases your happiness. More data to back up this idea. This is a graph showing results from, again, many different surveys across many different years. And we've got a couple things going on here. So we've got two y-axes. On our left y-axis, we've got average income, and this is for $1995. So at the top, we've got $25,000. At the bottom, we've got $5,000, and it actually does go down to zero. And that's represented by our bolded line here, our thick, dark line. So average income across this 50-year time span seems to be increasing. But let's take a look at these dots here. These dots here represent very happy people, percent of people who are very happy, and that's our right-handed y-axis here, 100% down to 0%. And it just hovers right around 30, 35%. So even though average income is increasing for this 50-year time span, the percentage of people who say they are very happy in the United States has stayed relatively the same. About 35% of our population says they're very happy, despite the fact that they seem to be getting more money over these years. So it seems like, at least from this data, money and happiness are not really that related. So why not? Why is money and happiness not as strongly related as we think they are? Because remember, going back to some of the results we talked about, people think money will make them happy. And yes, that is true to a point, but there becomes a point where more money does not equal more happiness. And researchers introduce and explain this using the hedonic treadmill, the hedonic treadmill. So, the hedonic treadmill is this idea that no matter what happens in our life, we will relatively quickly return to sort of a baseline level of happiness. This could be after major positive life events, or it could be after major negative life events. And research backs up this idea. People who win the lottery, they will say that they experience an initial huge surge of happiness, and it lasts for about a month. But after that month, they quickly return back to their normal level of happiness before they won the lottery. So even though their life is unmistakably changed, they have enormous amounts of wealth that they didn't have before, their life is still pretty much back to the same level of happiness. That's kind of sad if you ask me. Even though something truly great can happen to you, change your life for the better, it still doesn't really have this long lasting impact. But the bright side is that negative life events have a relatively short lived experience as well. People who are diagnosed with cancer will often say the same thing. They have about a month where, they're just borderline depressed. It's this terrible thing that's just hanging over their head. They can't not think about it. It's having a really bad negative impact on their happiness. But after that month, a lot of people will say that their happiness level has returned back to somewhat normal pre-cancer diagnosis, which to me, that's encouraging. That sounds incredibly optimistic. That's wonderful that humans are able to do that. So that's the idea of this hedonic treadmill. No matter what happens, we're going to eventually return to this baseline level of happiness. So, to express this idea a little bit more, imagine living in Europe in the year 1000 AD or 1000 CE. Now, imagine how things have changed to the year 2000, just 23 years ago now. So, a lot of good things have happened in that 1000-year time span, right? I mean, the quality of life is much, much better for so many people on the planet. Uh, Lifespans are so much longer. Quality of life is so much better. People have access to so much more food, better, nutritious food. People have the ability to travel for fun. Retirement is a thing. Child labor is not really a thing. So there's just so many reasons why life today is better than it was 1,000 years ago. Why aren't we happier? Because life is undeniably better than it was 1,000 years ago. Well, again, we go back to this idea of the hedonic treadmill. The idea that no matter how good life gets, we return back to this baseline level of happiness. And we can kind of think about that in the future as well. Think about how things will be in the year 3000. Well, it's pretty common to find people who will say that life will be so much better. We'll have so many problems solved. People's health will be so much better. We'll have access to even better, more nutritious food. We'll live happier, healthier lives where we can gallivant all over the planet, maybe even to the moon and Mars if we want to. But research doesn't really support that idea. I mean, to be honest, things might just be as they are now. The hedonic treadmill just keeps chugging away. All right, so let's jump back a little bit and just remind ourselves of these two definitions. Emotion, physiological or mental state that affects behavior. Motivation, a need or desire that directs behavior. So we're going to shift from emotion towards motivation now, and how these needs or desires direct our behavior. So we're going to talk about a classic theory of motivation right away, and this is the drive reduction theory. In the drive reduction theory of motivation, the end goal of all behavior is what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis is this sort of theoretical state where all of our needs are met. We are perfectly in balance. We're not hungry. We're not thirsty. We're not anxious. We're not upset. We're just sort of perfectly calm. That's homeostasis. And the idea here is that we're constantly trying to reach homeostasis. So this little box is an arrow diagram. We have physiological needs like hunger or thirst. That creates a psychological drive. We experience hunger, we experience thirst, and that causes us to engage in drive reducing behaviors. So if we are thirsty, we need water. That's a physiological need that causes us to have a psychological drive. We experience thirst. We say, I'm thirsty. That causes us to get up, go to the sink, fill a glass of water, and drink it. That is a drive reducing behavior. So in this really simple example here, this is kind of the heart of drive reduction theory. We have these physiological needs. We experience some sort of emotional state that causes us to engage in a drive reducing behavior that makes it so we no longer have that physiological need, and that brings us back to homeostasis. Now, the truth is, homeostasis is boring. Homeostasis is so uninteresting. Homeostasis is something that most of us honestly cannot stand for more than a few minutes at a time. So this begs the question, is homeostasis really the goal of our behavior? Is homeostasis getting back to this completely content sort of mindset or physiological state? Is that really the goal of all of our behavior? If that's the truth, why has anyone ever decided that climbing Mount Everest was a good idea? You remember Sir Edmund Hillary was the first recorded person to climb Mount Everest. When asked why he did it, his response was pretty simple: because it's there. Not exactly a resounding piece of evidence that supports this homeostasis theory. I have this picture posted here. This is a group skydiving. These are all women in this picture. My aunt was a professional skydiver for years and years and years. I believe she is this one right here in a white jumpsuit. This was an attempt to break the Guinness World Records for largest all-female parachute group, skydive group. They did not break the record because two people did not show up that day. They were out sick. So anyway, they had fun, but they didn't break the record. Skydiving, definitely not something that gets us to homeostasis. This kind of gets to this idea of optimum arousal. We want to be aroused. We want to be challenged. We want to be engaged in an activity. Skydiving, mountaineering, these are things that are obviously quite dangerous, but they engage us, they arouse us, they challenge us, they keep us interested. So this is sort of a different idea here. It's not that the goal is homeostasis, the goal is keeping ourselves challenged and aroused. So let's talk about two of the most powerful motivations on our behavior: food and sex. These two things have a huge influence on a lot of our behavior, either directly or indirectly. A lot of our behavior is motivated by either food or sex. So let's talk about these two. So remember, in psychology, we like the biopsychosocial model. and we're going to talk about some biological influences on sexual behavior now. So first would be hormones. So first of all, when we are in our early teenage years, a large release of hormones from our various glands, that is going to signal the onset of puberty. Our body goes through a bunch of different changes. We are ready for sexual activity. After that, hormones are released in a much different way. For men, sex hormones are released in sort of a constant trickle, I guess you could say. There are variations in the amount of hormones that are released for men across time. But those variations are relatively small, which means that men have a relatively constant motivation for sexual behavior. So men are sort of like permanently aroused, permanently ready to seek out sex. Women, on the other hand, it's a little bit different. Uh, Women go through puberty and then they reach this stage where they have pretty large fluctuations in the amount of hormones that are released. As a result, women's sexual behavior also has pretty large fluctuations. Women will seek out sexual behavior very differently depending on the time of the month, depending on their menstruation cycle. So it's a really quick and simple way to show just how biological factors, specifically hormones in the bloodstream, have an impact on sexual behavior. How often we think it's a good idea to seek out sexual behavior. Other biological factors for food and sex, we have to talk about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus plays a huge role in how we seek out food, how we seek out sexual behavior. We're just going to briefly talk about how it influences food-related behavior real quick. So the hypothalamus, it's this little chunk of neurons inside the limbic system, and it does a couple different things. And depending on where on the hypothalamus you stick an electrode, you can cause that organism to do some pretty interesting things. So the lateral part of the hypothalamus, which is referring to the sides of the hypothalamus, if you stick an electrode into the side of the hypothalamus and you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, you are going to cause that organism to be very, 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 very hungry. And if you keep that electrode in there and you keep stimulating the lateral hypothalamus, that organism is going to keep eating until you stop the stimulation. So as long as the lateral hypothalamus is active, that organism is going to experience hunger. Now let's say you do a little surgery and you lesion that part of the hypothalamus. You kill it, you slice it, you damage it in some way so that it does not function. If that's the case, that organism will never get hungry again. They will never experience hunger. Their body should absolutely still eat, but they won't experience hunger and they won't seek out food. They will literally starve to death, even if you put food in front of them. It's because they don't have anything in their brain telling them, hey, you're hungry. Your body is literally wasting away. You need to eat that food that's placed right in front of you. So the lateral hypothalamus seems to play a pretty big role in initiating hunger. The ventromedial hypothalamus, this would be in reference to the lower middle part, so kind of the middle of the underside of the hypothalamus. And you can do the same thing. You can stick an electrode in, and if you send a stimulation to the lower middle, the ventromedial part of the hypothalamus, that will depress hunger. That will tell the organism, hey, you're good, your stomach's full, you just ate, 7 pieces of pizza, that's enough, you're no longer hungry. Gotcha. So this part of the hypothalamus seems to help us stop eating. When it becomes active, that's the signal for us to no longer experience hunger. Now let's say you do a little surgery and you damage it, you lesion it. well, then that organism is not going to have a signal inside their hypothalamus to tell them to stop eating. As a result, they'll just keep eating and eating and eating and eating and eating. They will not stop eating because they don't have a part of their brain telling them to stop eating. So the hypothalamus, super important little gizmo that has a huge influence on our hunger behavior. So that's the bio side of the biopsychosocial model. Let's jump to the social side of the social biopsychosocial model. Culture will absolutely determine a little bit of our hunger behavior. Culture helps to determine what is food in the first place. If you look at the differences between Inuit or Eskimo culture and typical American food, well, you might look at a typical Inuit meal and think there's no way anyone is eating that, even though it might be a delicacy. Inuits will literally eat things like fermented walrus meat or rotten whale meat and blubber and think that it is just the most wonderful thing on the planet. Friends, who we hang out with, also has a pretty big impact on our hunger behavior. BMI levels between close friends are highly, highly correlated. So if a group of friends, if one person has a high BMI or a low BMI, you can predict with a high degree of accuracy what the BMI of the rest of that friend group is going to be. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. Who we hang out with has a pretty big impact on our food and eating behavior. Also, kind of not surprisingly, but kind of depressing, there was a study done back in the early 2000s where they subscribed teenagers to Teen Magazine, and they, after a couple of months, they asked the teens, how satisfied are you with your body? And unfortunately, the teens who had the subscription were much more dissatisfied with how their body looked compared to the teens that didn't have the subscription. So simply being exposed to this kind of media will have this big negative impact on our body satisfaction. Let's talk about some of the psychological impacts on hunger behavior. Our memory of our last meal. So how well we remember the last time we ate. That will have a big impact on how hungry we are. Turns out amnesics, people who suffer from memory problems, they tend to eat more because they don't have a memory of their last meal, or they have a very poor memory of when it occurred. So if you don't remember eating at lunch, when 2 o'clock rolls around, you might think, hey, I think I skipped lunch. I could probably eat lunch right now, even though it's only been 2 hours. Portion size, you've probably heard this one before. Portion size has a pretty big impact on our food-related behavior. The truth is, we tend to eat what's in front of us. Even nutrition experts, people who know that portion size affects how much we eat, they know they should know better, but yet they still fall prey to this, just like you and me. Ooh, what just happened here? Looks like we skipped everything. All right, let me bring this back up real quick. Oh, no, that was the last slide. All right, well, that is it. I thought I had more. All right, so thank you for the attention and stay tuned.